There are some moments in life that stick to you, even if you don't fully understand why. For me, it was a night when I was just a boy, barely old enough to know the names of the planets, let alone grasp their significance. My mother had this old telescope she kept stored away in the attic, a relic from her youth, I suppose. She decided it was time to dust it off and teach me about the stars. That night, she pointed it at the heavens and asked me to take a look at Jupiter. I still remember the excitement in her voice, the way she spoke about the massive gas giant, as if it were a friendly neighbor we hadn't visited yet. I wasn't nearly as enthusiastic, but I didn't want to disappoint her. So I peered through the lens, and for a few seconds, all I saw were the shimmering stars. Then, as I adjusted the focus, Jupiter came into view, larger than life, with its swirling red storms and bands of white and beige that stretched on forever. But something was wrong. It wasn't just the planet I saw. There was something else, something lurking just beyond the reach of the telescope's lens. It was like a shadow, dark and formless, but I could feel it more than I could see it. It was watching me. My skin prickled, and my breath caught in my throat. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't move. My legs locked, and I felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away from Jupiter. The stars around it seemed to dim, and a cold silence wrapped itself around me, even though my mother was still chatting away behind me. Then, in a split second, the feeling was gone. I jerked back from the telescope, almost falling over. My mother laughed, assuming I had simply lost my balance. I wanted to tell her what I had seen, what I had felt, but I couldn't find the words. How could I explain something like that? A dark presence watching me from the surface of a distant planet. It sounded absurd, even to my young mind. From that night on, I refused to look at the sky again. The stars, once a source of wonder, became something to fear. I avoided any mention of space, planets, or telescopes. Even the thought of them sent a shiver down my spine. Whenever someone brought up stargazing or planetary alignments, I found an excuse to change the subject. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to, something far beyond my understanding. As I grew older, my interests shifted. Where others found solace in looking up at the stars, I found peace in studying the ground beneath my feet. Geology became my passion. There was something reassuring about rocks and soil, something solid and predictable. The Earth didn't hold the same terrifying mysteries as the stars. It was something I could touch, something I could control, at least to some extent. By the time I was an adult, I had completely shut out that night from my memory. It became one of those things you bury so deep that it's almost as if it never happened. Almost. But even though I told myself it was just a childhood fear, that strange feeling still lingered at the edges of my mind, never fully letting go. I couldn't explain why, but every time I heard the name Jupiter, my stomach clenched. That's probably why I gravitated toward geology in the first place. It felt like the exact opposite of astronomy. Safe. Geologists don't need to worry about distant planets or stars. We deal with rocks, minerals, and the Earth's crust, all solid, tangible things. It was as if by studying the ground, I could keep myself grounded too. I told myself that the past was behind me, that what I'd seen through the telescope was nothing more than a childish hallucination. But deep down, I knew better. Then Sarah came into my life. She was everything I wasn't, outdoorsy, adventurous, and full of energy. We met on a hiking trip organized by some mutual friends, and from the moment we started talking, it was clear we were different in almost every way. But that didn't matter. If anything, it made our connection stronger. Sarah was the kind of person who could get anyone out of their shell, and I needed that. I had spent so much time keeping my head down, focused on my work, that I had forgotten how to enjoy life. It wasn't long before Sarah invited me on another adventure. This time, a stargazing trip with some of her outdoorsy friends. The moment she suggested it, my stomach tightened. I hadn't looked through a telescope since that night all those years ago, and the thought of doing it again made my hands clammy. But I didn't want to tell her that. How could I explain a fear that didn't make sense even to me? So I agreed, hoping that maybe it would be different this time. Maybe I could put those childhood fears behind me once and for all. We packed up and headed out to a remote campsite far from the city lights. Sarah was buzzing with excitement, pointing out constellations and naming stars I had never bothered to learn. Her friends were just as enthusiastic, setting up their telescopes and settling in for a long night of stargazing. I tried to enjoy it, I really did. But as the night grew darker and the stars shone brighter, I felt that old familiar dread creeping up on me. I should have told Sarah then, should have made up some excuse to leave. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, staring at the telescopes, feeling like a child again, frozen in place. All I could think about was Jupiter. It was out there, somewhere, watching. The campsite was secluded, far from any town or artificial light. Just as Sarah had promised, the quietness of the place was unsettling. There was no hum of traffic, no distant chatter of civilization, just the rustling of leaves in the cool night breeze and the occasional crackle of our campfire. Above us, the sky stretched out like a vast dark ocean, dotted with an infinite number of stars, each one shining down with a cold, distant light. It was the kind of sky that would have thrilled anyone else, but for me, it was suffocating. Sarah was in her element, smiling and laughing with her friends as they set up their telescopes. They were all excited to catch a glimpse of planets and constellations. She kept looking over at me, trying to gauge if I was enjoying myself. I forced a smile, not wanting to ruin her night, but inside, that old fear was creeping back. The last thing I wanted was to look through one of those telescopes again. But how could I explain that without sounding irrational? The night wore on, and soon enough, everyone had gathered around one of the larger telescopes to take turns gazing up at the sky. They pointed it towards various constellations at first, tracing the shapes with their fingers, sharing facts and stories about the stars. When someone mentioned Jupiter, my stomach twisted into knots. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I didn't have to look, that I could just sit back and let the others enjoy the view. But Sarah, oblivious to my growing unease, insisted that I take a look. "You can't miss this," she said, her voice full of excitement. "It's beautiful." I didn't want to disappoint her, so I stood up, my legs feeling like lead as I walked over to the telescope. Everyone was watching me, waiting for my reaction. I leaned in, my eye hovering just above the eyepiece. For a moment, all I saw was darkness, and I let out a breath, thinking maybe the telescope wasn't properly aligned. But then I adjusted the focus, and Jupiter came into view. It was enormous. The swirling clouds of gas and the unmistakable red storm that raged across its surface seemed close enough to touch. For a brief second, I felt a flicker of wonder, but it was quickly snuffed out by something darker. Just like all those years ago, I felt the presence again, watching me, studying me. My breath caught in my throat, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The stars around Jupiter seemed to dim, and the world outside the telescope faded into a distant hum. It was just me and the planet, and that shadowy presence that clung to it like a ghost. Suddenly, my body seized up. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as if some invisible force had wrapped itself around me, tightening its grip with each passing second. I wanted to scream, to pull away from the telescope, but I was trapped. Then I heard it, a voice, low and cold, whispering inside my mind. "I see you." The words sent a chill down my spine, and my vision blurred. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground. I must have fallen back, though I don't remember how. My whole body was trembling, and there was a sharp pain in my head. I could hear Sarah's voice, distant and frantic, calling my name. Her hands were on my shoulders, shaking me, trying to bring me back. Slowly, the world around me started to come into focus. The stars were above us again, but they seemed less real, as if they were part of some distant dream I had yet to wake from. "Are you okay?" Sarah's voice was strained, her eyes wide with concern. I nodded, though I didn't trust myself to speak just yet. The others were standing around us, looking shocked and confused. One of Sarah's friends muttered something about a seizure, and I latched onto that explanation. It was easier than trying to explain what had really happened, easier than admitting that I was being haunted by a planet light years away. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak. Sarah helped me to my feet, and I could feel her eyes on me, searching for some clue as to what had just happened. "I'm fine," I managed to say, though my voice was shaky. It must have been the altitude or something. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press me on it either. We sat down by the fire, and I could see her friends whispering to each other, stealing glances at me as if I were some kind of fragile object that might break at any moment. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed as far away from the telescopes as possible, keeping my gaze fixed on the flames of the campfire, trying to ignore the persistent whisper in the back of my mind. "I see you." I could still hear it, even now, echoing in my skull like the remnants of a nightmare. It felt like a warning, or maybe a promise, something I couldn't quite decipher but couldn't shake either. As we packed up the next morning, Sarah stayed close to me, her hand resting on my arm as if she was afraid I might collapse again. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was just a one-time thing, probably exhaustion or dehydration, but I knew that wasn't the truth. I had seen something up there, something I wasn't meant to see. And now, it had seen me too. The drive home was quiet. Sarah kept glancing at me from the driver's seat, but I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what had happened when I didn't fully understand it myself? All I knew was that something had changed. I wasn't the same person I had been before I looked through that telescope. Something had been set in motion, something I couldn't stop or control. And whatever it was tied to Jupiter, just as it had been all those years ago. That night, after we got home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jupiter, looming large and distant in the sky, its red storm churning, its shadows shifting. And always, always, I heard that voice, "I see you." It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a presence, something real and inescapable, like the pull of gravity. And I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. It didn't take long after the camping trip for things to start falling apart. At first, I convinced myself that what happened was just an isolated incident, a weird moment brought on by exhaustion, stress, or something else easily explained. But that lie didn't last long. The voice, the one I'd heard in my head when I looked at Jupiter, stayed with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again, soft and insistent. "I see you." No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the words looped in the background of my thoughts like a haunting melody I couldn't shut off. The hallucination started soon after. It began with flashes of light in the corners of my vision. Just quick, fleeting things that I thought were my eyes playing tricks on me. But then they got worse. One night, as I was sitting in my office, sorting through old rock samples, I saw Jupiter. It wasn't on a computer screen or in a book. It was right there, hanging in the corner of the room, impossibly large and menacing. The planet's storm was swirling faster than any image I'd ever seen, and I could almost hear the winds howling from across the solar system. I blinked, and it was gone. But the fear stayed with me. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I sat there, breathing heavily, telling myself it was just stress, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The more I tried to dismiss it, the stronger the sensation became, like something was reaching out to me from a place I couldn't comprehend. Sarah noticed. Of course, she did. She had been patient after the camping trip, giving me space to process everything that had happened. But as the days went on, and as I became more withdrawn, she started asking questions. "Are you okay?" she would ask, her voice filled with concern. "Is this about what happened at the camp? Maybe we should see a doctor." I tried to brush it off, telling her I was just tired, that work was stressful, but she wasn't buying it. The truth was, I didn't know how to explain what was happening to me. How could I tell her that I was hearing voices, seeing things that shouldn't be there? How could I tell her that a planet, millions of miles away, was somehow watching me? The hallucinations weren't just visual either. There were sounds, strange and distorted, like static or whispers, creeping in from the edges of silence. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and heard a faint droning hum coming from outside our window. I got out of bed and walked over to the glass, expecting to see nothing but the dark, quiet street. Instead, I saw the sky lit up with pale, flickering lights, like faint stars or reflections of something far off in space. And there, just above the horizon, Jupiter loomed again, bigger than ever, as if it had inched closer, claiming more of the sky. I stepped back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Sarah stirred in bed behind me, mumbling something in her sleep. I wanted to wake her, to tell her what I was seeing, but what good would it have done? She wouldn't see it. Only I could. The next day, Sarah insisted I go to the doctor. Reluctantly, I agreed. The tests came back normal, of course. No sign of a seizure disorder, no neurological issues, nothing. I was physically healthy, but my mind, that was a different story. The doctor suggested it might be stress, maybe a delayed response to the camping trip, or some unresolved childhood trauma. He offered to refer me to a therapist, but I refused. How could therapy help with something like this? The hallucinations got worse after that. I couldn't escape them. Every night, Jupiter appeared in my dreams, its massive red eyes staring down at me, unblinking, relentless. I heard the voice more frequently now, always whispering the same thing. I see you. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It felt like a presence, something vast and ancient, something I couldn't escape. I started losing track of time. I would sit down at my desk in the morning, intending to work on a report, and suddenly hours would pass, with no memory of what I had been doing. My hands would tremble as I tried to hold on to some sense of normalcy, but it was slipping away, and fast. Sarah tried to help. She suggested we take a break, go somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the city, where I could clear my head. I hesitated at first, afraid that no matter where we went, I wouldn't be able to outrun whatever was haunting me. But I agreed. Maybe a change of scenery would help. Maybe it would drown out the whispers, at least for a little while. We packed up the car and headed west, driving for hours without any real destination in mind. As we drove, I felt a strange pull. It wasn't something I could explain, more like an instinct, a feeling deep in my gut that told me where we needed to go. I kept quiet about it, not wanting to worry Sarah, but the sensation grew stronger with every mile. Eventually, I told her to turn off the highway and follow a winding road that led deep into the countryside. We ended up at a lake, one I hadn't thought about in years. It was the same lake my parents used to take me to when I was a kid, back when everything was simpler, before the night I saw Jupiter through that cursed telescope. As we parked the car, I felt that eerie pull again, something beckoning me toward the water. The lake was quiet, the surface perfectly still, like a sheet of glass reflecting the sky above. I could see the clouds, soft and white, drifting lazily across the horizon. But there was something else too, something beneath the water, something I couldn't quite make out. I shook my head, trying to clear the thought, but the pull was stronger than ever. Sarah was the one who noticed it first. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. She pointed to the far end of the lake, where the surface had started to ripple, as if something large had disturbed the water from below. I squinted, trying to see through the glare of the setting sun, and that's when it happened. Something crashed into the lake, something huge and unnatural, sending a massive wave rolling across the water. The sight of it took my breath away. I had no idea what it was, but it felt connected to everything I had experienced. Whatever had fallen into that lake had come from the sky, maybe even from Jupiter itself, and somehow I knew that this was only the beginning. The moment the object hit the lake, the world seemed to freeze. I stood there, staring at the water, unable to process what I had just witnessed. It had come down so fast, so suddenly, that it felt like some surreal dream. But the shockwave from the impact was very real. I could see the water swell and ripple outward, the once still surface now churning violently. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my feet were glued to the ground, unable to move. Sarah was beside me, just as stunned, her hand gripping my arm tightly as if she were afraid we might get swept up by whatever had just come from the sky. For a long moment, nothing happened. The lake stilled again, but the object, whatever it was, had vanished beneath the surface, leaving nothing behind but a faint disturbance in the water. Then, without warning, the surface of the lake began to drain, as if an invisible plug had been pulled from the bottom. The water was rushing away, faster than any natural process could explain, revealing a landscape that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. Sarah gasped beside me, her eyes wide with disbelief. The lake was disappearing before our eyes, draining away to reveal a dark, jagged cavern at the center of its bed. The cave seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the kind of eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I could feel it in the air, thick and heavy like a storm was about to break. But there were no clouds, no wind, just that strange silence, as though the world was holding its breath. I didn't want to go any closer, but my body had other ideas. It was like something deep within me was pulling me forward, toward that dark, gaping mouth in the earth. I fought the urge with every ounce of willpower I had, but my legs moved on their own, stumbling forward as if I were being dragged by invisible strings. "Wait," Sarah called after me, grabbing my hand. "Where are you going?" Her voice trembled with fear, and I could feel her panic rising. She must have sensed the change in me, the way I had lost control. I tried to answer, tried to tell her that I didn't know, but the words stuck in my throat. My mind was clouded, full of strange whispers and images I didn't understand. I could feel Jupiter again, hanging in the sky, even though I couldn't see it. Its presence was unmistakable, like a weight pressing down on my chest, demanding something from me. The cave yawned wider as the water continued to drain, revealing more of the jagged rocks and strange formations beneath. I could see something moving in the shadows, something vast and unearthly, slithering just beyond the edges of my vision. It was as if the object that had crashed into the lake had unlocked something that had been waiting there for centuries, hidden beneath the surface. And now, it was waking up. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like someone had driven a knife between my ribs. I doubled over, gasping for air as the world around me spun out of control. The voice was back, louder and more insistent than ever. "You owe us," it said, echoing in my mind like a death sentence. "You have always owed us." Sarah was beside me, her face pale and terrified. "What's happening to you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She tried to steady me, but I could feel my body convulsing, as if something was trying to tear me apart from the inside. My vision blurred, and the world around me faded in and out of focus. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then, as quickly as it had started, the pain vanished. I was left gasping for breath, my body slick with sweat, but the tightness in my chest had eased. The voice had gone silent, for now, but I knew it wasn't over. Something had marked me, something far older and more powerful than I could comprehend. I managed to stand, though my legs were shaky. Sarah's hand was still gripping mine, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't understand what was happening, and neither did I. But there was no time to explain. The cave loomed before us, dark and ominous, its entrance still pulsing with that strange otherworldly energy. "I think we need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Whatever that was, it's not safe." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't change anything. Whatever had come for me wasn't bound to this place. It had found me, and it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. Still, I turned to go, letting Sarah lead the way back to the car. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with half-formed thoughts and memories I couldn't quite grasp. But before we could make it far, a low, rumbling sound filled the air. It wasn't like thunder. It was deeper, more primal, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. We froze, turning back toward the lake just in time to see the ground around the cave start to tremble. Rocks tumbled down the edges of the now exposed lakebed, and a gust of hot, sulfurous air rushed out from the cave, making the trees around us sway and bend. I could feel the pull again, stronger this time, like an invisible hand was reaching out from the depths of that cavern, beckoning me back. My legs began to move on their own, but Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "Don't," she pleaded. "We have to go. Now." For a moment, I hesitated, torn between the primal urge to follow the pull and the logical part of my brain screaming at me to get out. The air around us felt electric, charged with some unknown energy. I had never felt anything like it before, and it terrified me. Then, without warning, the ground beneath us buckled, and we stumbled backward. The lakebed began to cave in, collapsing in on itself as the rumbling grew louder. A massive wave of dust and debris shot up into the air, and we ran, barely making it back to the car as the ground continued to shake. I slammed the door behind us just as another loud crash echoed through the valley, followed by an eerie silence. We sat there, breathing heavily, hearts racing, as the dust settled around us. I glanced back toward the lake, but the cave was gone, buried beneath the rubble and dirt. Whatever had been down there, whatever had woken up, was now sealed away again. For how long, I didn't know, but as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Whatever had come for me wasn't finished yet. It was still out there, waiting, watching. And somehow, I knew it wouldn't be long before it found me again. The drive home was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind against the car's windows. Sarah kept glancing over at me, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. What was there to say? How could I explain that I felt like something had changed inside me, that I was somehow different now? The pull I had felt toward the lake, the overwhelming sense of something ancient calling out to me, it was still there, a low hum beneath my thoughts, a feeling I couldn't shake. When we finally reached home, I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the events of the past few days, but my mind was still racing. No matter how hard I tried to relax, the image of that dark, yawning cave beneath the lake kept resurfacing in my thoughts. And then, of course, there was the voice. "You owe us." The words echoed in my head like a drumbeat, steady and unrelenting. Sarah sat beside me, her eyes filled with concern. "We need to talk," she said softly, but there was a firmness in her tone. She wasn't going to let me brush this off, not this time. I nodded, though I didn't know where to start. How could I even begin to explain the strange connection I felt to something as distant and cold as Jupiter? I could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that whatever had happened to me at the lake wasn't over, and she was right, it wasn't. But I couldn't drag her into this, couldn't burden her with the weight of something neither of us could fully understand. "I don't know what's happening to me," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper, "but I can't shake the feeling that it's connected to Jupiter. Ever since I was a kid, I've felt like it's been watching me. And now, after what happened at the lake, it feels even stronger." Sarah listened quietly, her hand resting on mine. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to offer any explanations. She just let me talk, let me get it all out. When I finished, she sat back, thinking for a moment before speaking. "We'll figure this out," she said finally, her voice calm but determined. "Whatever it is, we'll find a way to deal with it. You're not alone in this." Her words should have been comforting, but instead, they only filled me with a deep sense of dread. I was alone in this. No one else could hear the voice, feel the pull. This was my burden to carry, my debt to pay. But I nodded anyway, hoping that somehow I could shield her from the worst of it. The following weeks passed in a strange blur. I tried to return to my routine, focusing on work, on getting back to some semblance of normalcy. But normal had slipped through my fingers, and no matter how hard I tried to grasp it again, it was gone. The hallucinations didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. I would be sitting at my desk, working on a report, when the room would warp around me, and for a moment, I would find myself standing on the surface of some distant alien landscape. Jupiter always loomed above me, impossibly close, its swirling red storm ever present, like a great unblinking eye. The voice, too, became more insistent. It no longer whispered from the edges of my mind. It shouted, demanding my attention, reminding me of the debt I owed. "I see you," it would say, over and over again. "You owe us." I couldn't escape it, couldn't shut it out. It was with me when I woke up in the morning, when I went to bed at night. It was relentless, a constant reminder that something was coming for me, and there was no way to stop it. Sarah remained by my side through it all, though I could see the strain it was putting on her. She tried to be strong, to keep up the facade of normalcy, but I could see the cracks forming. We both knew that whatever was happening to me wasn't going away, and there was no telling how much worse it would get. Then, one evening, something changed. Sarah had been feeling nauseous for days, and at first, we thought it was just stress or something she ate. But when the symptoms didn't go away, she decided to take a pregnancy test. I wasn't prepared for the results. Neither of us were. She was pregnant. The news should have been joyous. We had talked about starting a family before, and despite everything that had been happening, we had still dreamed of building a future together. But now, in the shadow of all that had happened, the idea of bringing the child into the world terrified me. How could I protect them from this thing that had marked me? How could I raise a child when I didn't even know if I could keep myself safe? But Sarah was ecstatic. For the first time in weeks, I saw her smile, a real, genuine smile, and it almost made me forget the fear that had been gnawing at me for so long. Almost. She talked about names, about how we would decorate the nursery, about the future she saw for our family, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe in that future too. But deep down, I knew that the clock was ticking. The voice in my head didn't stop. Even after we found out about the baby, it only grew louder, more demanding. You owe us. The words became a constant presence, louder than my own thoughts. I couldn't escape them. As the days passed, I found myself growing more anxious, more afraid. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something terrible, and it would arrive before the baby was born. I didn't know how to explain it to Sarah, didn't know how to tell her that despite all her optimism, I didn't believe we would ever get the chance to live the life she envisioned. One night, as we lay in bed, I stared up at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel it. The pull. It was stronger now, more insistent than ever. Something was coming for me, and no matter how hard I tried to run from it, there was no escape. I turned to Sarah, who was already asleep, her face peaceful and content. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to cry, silent tears rolling down my cheeks as I realized that I couldn't protect her, not from this. The weight of it all pressed down on me, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was running out of time.